It was now October 1942, and especially in our oasis. The daily flights of the Ghibli revealed nothing out of the ordinary in our sector. Our days in the singularly beautiful oasis of Siwa were undoubtedly numbered. The reports of British preparations for an offensive were accumulating. I worked out a plan to enable the rear sections, including the bakery platoon, to march in the direction of the coast without being threatened by the British advance. In addition, I discussed with the company commanders the two possible ways in which we might go into action, either via the winding road to the north or to the west via the Djirabub oasis, veering north from there. I was well stocked with fuel and ammunition. All the water canisters were filled. We had to figure that, after the coming offensive, the confusion would be so great that in the early days the delivery of supplies in the depths of the desert was not something we could count on. In the middle of October, according to our information, the British had 1,000 tanks at their disposal, including 400 of the new, superior American-made Shermans, against which we could put up just 200. Opposing the 195,000 British, including their allies, who were all fully motorized, we had on our side 24,000 men. In the middle of October, we received only 44% of the minimum supplies for the next 11 days. Our tanks were furnished with fuel for a mere 300 kilometers. In addition, the air superiority of our opponents was complete. Our few fighters, which likewise suffered from lack of fuel, could not compete. On the 23rd of October, the expected inferno broke forth with 1,000 guns and sustained attacks by the Royal Air Force. Montgomery opened concentrated fire on our positions and in doing so blasted a hole in our minefields. My battalion was put on the alert. Counter-attack by 15th Panzer Division planned for tomorrow, Gauss informed us. You will hold yourself ready for counter-attack or to protect southern flank. The orders came in a radio message from Gauss, which was intercepted by Ultra at Bletchley Park. This was told to me in 1985 by Gene Howard. The fact that all our actions were known at once to the British represented for us a further catastrophe. Next day, we received more alarming news. General Stummer, on a visit to the front, had come under a sudden concentration of fire and died, presumably of a heart attack. Rommel had broken off his treatment at once and returned to Derna still not well on the 25th of October. That put fresh heart into our people. Our counterattack was ineffective. Under the hail of bombs and the rockets used for the first time by the British fighters, and in face also of a defensive line of tanks, it broke down. But the Africa Corps and the Italian divisions offered fierce resistance to the British offensive. Up to the 29th of October, Monty was unable to force a breakthrough, although our positions were exposed ceaselessly to the attacks of the Royal Air Force and heavy artillery fire. The bombers and fighters came in flyover formation, as though it were peacetime, even by night, when the whole battlefield was lit by flares. Monty regrouped. During the night of 1 to the 2nd of November 1942, a second offensive began. With 400 tanks and strong artillery and air support, he launched an attack on a narrow sector of the northern front against an unfortunate inferior Italian division and forced a breakthrough. The division was wiped out after the majority of the Italians had been wounded or killed. Rommel pulled out the 21st Panzer Division, which had been stationed in the south, and threw it against the point of breakthrough. At the same time, I received orders to fill the gap and support the 20th Italian Corps, which was left on its own. That same day, the 2nd of November, in accordance with our prearranged plan, I ordered the supply sections, including the bakery platoon, to go to our supply centre in Cyrenaica. To maintain vital contact for our supplies, I gave them a radio-armoured car. Before dawn on the 3rd of November, we left the Siwa oasis. We arrived in the area of the 20th Italian Corps, which, for the moment, had not yet come under strong attack, except from the Royal Air Force. I was able, thank goodness, to keep in constant touch with Rommel's HQ. I was informed that Rommel would shortly be giving the order to retreat, since our front, which had been broken through at several points, could no longer hold out against the superior enemy and the constant air attacks. By giving up Cyrenaica, Rommel planned to reach Tripolitania and set up a line of defence there. In so doing, it seemed to him important to bring to safety, over a distance of nearly 2,000 kilometres, as many units as possible, especially the battered, non-motorised Italian infantry divisions. In the midst of these considerations, a briefly worded order from the Führer reached Rommel at midday to the effect that there was no other choice for our soldiers but victory or death. With that, any retreat was forbidden by the highest authority. As he told me a few weeks after the event, Rommel wavered between doing his duty of absolute obedience to the oath he had taken and the reality at the front, with the threatening destruction that implied of the whole Africa army. That same afternoon of the 3rd of November, he decided to pass on to his commanders the Führer's order to hold fast. The men, however, were not to be informed. Rommel was sorely frustrated, but for the present he obeyed. On the morning of the 4th of November, after strong artillery preparation, the British launched an attack against the Africa Corps. By using 200 tanks, including many of the superior Shermans, and against bitter resistance from the 20 tanks left to us, deep breaches were made. But the Africa Corps still held out and inflicted considerable losses on the enemy, mainly with our 88mm. While the enemy could replace his losses immediately, we lacked any replacements of tanks, heavy weapons, and ammunition. Then, however, toward 10 o'clock, after renewed heavy artillery fire and relays of attack by the Royal Air Force, the British moved against the front of the 20th Italian Corps, which, with its poorly equipped defensive weapons, stood no chance of stopping the attack. I tried to give the Italians as much help as possible, but with my armoured reconnaissance vehicles and their equally weak anti-tank guns, any help I could offer was more moral than effective. It was heartrending to have to witness how the Ariete Division, our most loyal allies, and the remains of the Trieste and Littorio divisions fought with death-defying courage, how their tanks, the sardine tins so often mocked by us, were shot up and left burning on the battlefield. Although I was engaged in actions myself, I kept in contact with the 20th Italian Corps until it was almost surrounded. At about 3:30 p.m., the commander of the Ariete Division sent his last radio message to Rommel. "We are encircled, the Ariete tanks still in action." By evening, the 20th Italian Corps had been destroyed. We lost good, brave friends, from whom we demanded more than they were in a position to give. The British now stormed through a breach 20 kilometres wide and threatened a southern outflanking of the Africa Corps, which was fighting desperately in the north. At that, Rommel decided to begin an immediate retreat and thus ignore Hitler's order. Of the 750 or so tanks which the Africa Army had at its disposal before the British offensive, only 12 were still available to us. I received orders to disengage from the enemy and transfer in the first place to the area between Siwa and the Djaraboub oasis, which was already in Libyan territory west of Siwa. My task was to reconnoitre in every direction and report or prevent any outflanking attempt south of the movement of retreat. In the morning of the 5th of November, I reached an area north of the Siwa and Djaraboub oases without coming into contact with the enemy. Our patrols were positioned in a wide fan, with observation to the east, the southeast, and the south. Sandstorms and heavy downpours of rain set in, making many tracks almost impassable for the elements of the Africa Army that were now falling back. Next day, we had our first contact with the enemy, with British patrols that had been sent out, it seemed, to explore the possibility of a southern outflanking, but they proved easy to repulse. On the 7th of November, in the depths of the desert, a patrol putting out a long feeler to the east discovered General Ramke, the commander of the paratroop division, which had been in action on the right wing south of Alamein. General Ramke was brought to us in a scout car. He looked emaciated and asked to be taken at once to Rommel. His paratroops, an elite unit, had been through an adventurous time. I at once sent a radio message to Rommel. "General Ramke, with 700 men and all weapons, has been discovered by us. He himself is with me at the command post." Rommel replied that he had been very worried about the paratroops and had almost given them up. I was to have the general taken to him at once and to convey his men to him with available vehicles. I shall never forget the sight of Ramke's men coming toward us, exhausted, out of the desert. For reasons of space, they had left everything behind except for weapons and water, but their morale was astonishing. In the morning of the 8th of November, Rommel appeared at my command post east of the Egyptian-Libyan border and gave me a review of the general situation. The Africa Army had been in full retreat toward the Libyan border since the 1st of November. We were resisting the vigorous British advance with our last resources. The fuel that had been landed in Benghazi had come too late or not even reached the German panzer divisions. As a result, some of the last tanks had had to be blown up. At that moment, only 4 tanks were ready for action. The burden of defence was falling, therefore, mainly on the 88mm guns. Rommel spoke of the terrible scenes that were taking place on the coastal road. Pursued by British tanks and covered inescapably by carpets of bombs, vehicles were left standing in flames, while the men tried to save themselves on foot. Owing to these insurmountable obstacles, the supply trucks were hardly able to make progress. Rommel's intention was to hold open the border passes into Libya and channel through them, directed by pickets of officers, the greater part of the Africa Army. I could see the profound disappointment in Rommel's face. Through Hitler's crazy order to hold out, we lost a vital day, which cost us losses that cannot be made good. I can't hold Cyrenaica, so with the remains of the Africa Corps under General Bayerlein, I shall cross southern Cyrenaica, despite the rains and the sandstorms, in order to set up a first line of defence at Mersa El Brega, just short of Tripolitania. I have information, Rommel continued, that the British, by means of reconnaissance detachments and scout cars, are trying to explore and prepare a southern outflanking of the whole Africa Corps. This is a deadly danger. So I'm going to send you the Voss reconnaissance group. You will then be strong enough to prevent any outflanking. Rommel seemed unbroken, but one couldn't fail to notice how disillusioned he was at being left in the lurch in this way by the highest authority. What had become of Rommel's proud Africa army? How depressing it must have been for him to have to give up in a matter of days all that had once been conquered in unprecedented operations. All of us now felt that we had to stand by our Rommel. Major Voss and Major Linau appeared with their battalions. The Panzer Reconnaissance Group of the Africa Army was formed under my command. From Voss, I heard more of the appalling events unfolding at the coast. It was terrible to have to see how the Italians and our own people hung in clusters on the few vehicles that were still intact, Voss reported. Some of the remaining tanks were on tow, as they were out of fuel. The supply vehicles could hardly make their way forward against the retreating masses. Worst of all was the helplessness in face of the Royal Air Force, which covered the one asphalt road with bombs and machine gun fire, not only by day but also by night. I divided up our operational territory so that it could be watched over without a break by our 3 battalions. Next day, Gauss sent us, in addition, a Fiesler Stork, that well-tried light aircraft for reconnaissance and communication, which was now to be very useful to us, since we had had to return the Italian Ghibli. My adjutant or I went up in the plane once or twice a day to gain a general view of the terrain or of possible enemy movements. This saved fuel for our reconnaissance vehicles. On the 5th of November, the remains of the once proud Africa Army crossed the border into Libya. In 10 days, on the 13th of November, our weary, decimated units reached Mersa El Brega. At the cost of terrible losses, 1,000 kilometers had been covered. The 21st Panzer Division had 4 tanks left. On the 8th of November, HQ informed me that the Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria, and there was a danger that the Africa Army could be shut in on 2 sides. As a result, German Luftwaffe units landed in and around Tunis on the 9th of November, and paratroops on the 11th. To follow were the 10th German Panzer Division and an Italian division. The 5th Panzer Army was formed. The news of the American landing alarmed us, although we were still a long way from Tunisia. There were rumours that the French, with a task force from Chad, were on the march through the desert in the direction of Tunisia in order to cut us off via the south. Some days later, Rommel's HQ informed me that I was to be sent an Italian armoured reconnaissance battalion, the Nizza. At first I was not very pleased, as I had no great opinion of Italian weapons or morale. They duly arrived, well spread out and apparently still at normal fighting strength. Their commander, a tall, fair-haired major, presented himself. As he told me later, he had been given the posting for disciplinary reasons, because of an affair with a member of the royal house. The officers and men came exclusively from the north. They were proud Piedmontese and Venetians. They wanted to show that they knew how to fight. "May our patrols go on reconnaissance with yours?" I was asked by the commander and his officers. That would be the best way for us to learn. I inspected their armoured cars and weapons. "More sardine tins?" said our men, who were standing around inquisitively. Indeed, the equipment didn't even approach the standard of that which we had at the start of the Polish campaign. It was hopelessly inferior to the British Humbers and anti-tank guns. And yet, the Italians wanted to be sent into action at the front. In the difficult weeks that followed, my feelings wavered between admiration and pity for these brave men who, despite heavy losses, didn't give up and so remained to the end, our good friends. We have, without doubt, often done our Italian allies an injustice. Frequently mocked by our men as spaghetti eaters, they were regarded, on account of their combat performance, as more of a burden than a help. We failed to consider that their weapons and armoured cars were far from corresponding to the standard of those which we or our opponents employed in North Africa. The Italians have a cheerful, amiable disposition. They are of a different mentality from us Germans. It is said of them that they work to live, whereas we are supposed to live to work. There is no doubt that the Italians are outstanding engineers, designers, and road builders. They have given the world the most beautiful operas, and they are the best interpreters of classical music. The past culture of the Romans still marks these people today, and it has influenced all other modern cultures. Charm, gaiety, and a Mediterranean climate always exercise their fascination on visitors to their beautiful country. All these qualities and characteristics determine, therefore, the features of the Italian soldier. He doesn't take war with deadly seriousness, and ends it for his part when he considers it to be hopeless. Hitler's pathetic, cynical maxim, "The German soldier stands or dies," is, to the Italian, profoundly alien. It is against this background that the active service and performance of our allies is to be seen. So much more highly did we value the service of the Nizza battalion, whose officers and men fought bravely beside and with us to the bitter end. The lack of replacements of weapons, ammunition and fuel, the supply problem now had a catastrophic effect on the retreat. It was not only that many tanks and combat vehicles had to be towed back or blown up. At times, parts of the German Panzer Corps faced the attacks of the British tanks and the Royal Air Force with no fuel. Our reconnaissance battalion was greatly indebted to its supply officer. Time and again he managed to organise the fuel that was vital to us and deliver it to us through the desert in small convoys. Only once was a convoy caught between British lines and destroyed, as was reported to us by the accompanying radio car. For us, that meant water rationing, 1/2 litre of water per man per day for 10 days on end. 1/2 litre to drink without thinking of washing and shaving. This measure was necessary, since without water in the depths of the desert we would have been hopeless. In spite of great privation, we endured the 10 days. From the 6th of November, my reconnaissance group at this time deep in the desert operated at first from the Djarabub oasis, which lay about 250 kilometres south of the coast. The stony desert here was not as flat as it was further north, where it permitted large-scale military operations. The further south we moved, the more mountainous the terrain became. In places, ridges with cliffs, scoured by the wind, ran from north to south, and thus formed an obstacle that could hardly be overcome. Then, further south, the sandy desert began, with its high, impassable dunes. Long-drawn wadis offered cover and thus protection against surprise attacks. By day it was very hot, and at night, so cold that everyone was glad to have his coat and scarf on hand. Again and again we were hit by sandstorms or deluges of rain. Contact with the enemy was resumed. We came upon our old friends, the Royal Dragoons and the 11th Hussars, with whom we had already been involved during our advance on Alamein. Although we knew we were covering and shielding the withdrawal of the Africa army to the west, we had no feeling of being in flight. We operated to all quarters of the compass with the object of maintaining contact with the enemy and getting a clear idea of his intentions. Prisoners had to be taken, in order to learn from them something of the enemy's plans. Our armoured patrols developed their net tactic. In flat terrain, with a range of sight of more than 15 kilometres, our very fast 8-wheelers formed a large circle, into which they lured the British Humbers and scout cars, in order to close the net from two sides. This tactic usually worked, though we sometimes lost isolated scout cars through the more powerful cannons of the Humbers. The first prisoners were brought in to me. Some of them greeted me with, "Glad to meet you again, Reckies." The British obviously kept their sense of humour in all eventualities. After the usual small talk, we knew that the main job of the two British battalions was to prevent us from trying to interrupt Montgomery's supply routes by an attack from the depths of the desert. Much more interesting, however, was something a young officer said, which he regretted as soon as he had opened his mouth. The long-range desert group, under Major Stirling, had the task of finding a route for a whole British tank division through the mountainous country further to the south. From then on, the hunt for Sterling, as we called it, began. Sometimes we found vehicle tracks which could only have come from his scout cars, but time and again, this clever unit managed to evade our clutches. A couple of weeks later, a patrol succeeded in catching one of the long-range Desert Group's command cars, which had lost its way. In the vehicle, we captured a map on which was marked the exact route across a mountain range, by which a whole British tank division might have attempted a wide outflanking of our prepared positions on the coast. Thanks to this map, Rommel was able to save parts of the Afrika Korps from the threat of encirclement. In time, we got to know the names of the commanders of the 2 British reconnaissance battalions. I too was often addressed by prisoners. "You are Major von Luck. We'd have been glad to catch you." While the Afrika Army was putting every effort into fighting an orderly withdrawal action on the coast and then straight across Cyrenaica, we, with our 4 battalions, were able to operate freely for 3 weeks, unmolested by tank and air attacks. We quickly developed a certain routine. Toward 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the reconnaissance patrols broke off their operations in order to reach base in good time. In the treeless desert with no landmarks, it was impossible to find one's way back to base in the dark. To avoid betraying our position, light signals were used only in an emergency. The 2 British battalions carried on in the same way, so that from 5 p.m. all reconnaissance and combat activity was suspended, to be resumed again the following morning as soon as it was light. We could really agree to a ceasefire with the British from 5 p.m. until the next morning, I said, more as a joke to those around me. Why not? I was supported by Lieutenant Wenzel Luedecker, the reserve officer who had worked at the UFA film studios as an assistant director. After all, he went on, the British have a sense of humour. We ought to suggest it to them. Chance came to our aid. One evening, when all our patrols were back, I received a visit from my intelligence officer. "The Royal Dragoons are on the radio," he said, "and they would like to speak to you." "Hello, Royal Dragoons here. I know it's unusual to make radio contact with you, but Lieutenant Smith and his scouting party have been missing since this evening. Is he with you? And if so, how are things with him and his men?" One of our patrols had indeed managed to take some prisoners. It turned out that they were Lieutenant Smith and his party. "Yes, he is with us. All of them are unhurt and send greetings to their family and friends." Then came the brainstorm. "Can we call you too, or the 11th Hussars, if we have anyone missing?" "Sure, your calls are always welcome." It was only a matter of days before we had arrived at a gentleman's agreement. At 5 p.m. precisely, all hostilities would be suspended. We called it tea time. At 5:05 p.m. we would make open contact with the British to exchange news about prisoners, etc. In fact, from a distance of about 15 kilometres, we could often see the British get out their Primus stoves and make their tea. The agreement was kept by both sides, until we were forced by events to give up the connection in Tunisia. The prisoners we took often had to stay with us for several days, until the next supply convoy arrived and was able to take them away with it. We gave them whatever we could spare from our rations. One evening, when our radio stations had tuned in once again to the Belgrade transmitter, and we heard the song Lily Marleen, some of the prisoners joined in. "Over there we listen to Lily Marleen every evening," they said. "There's already an English version. Monty has strictly forbidden it, but we like the song and its sentimental words." The French and the Americans also listened to it, as we found out later. Somehow it made things easier. Our 5 o'clock tea agreement had some remarkable consequences. One evening, a patrol came back with 2 men and a jeep captured in the desert. A tall, fair-haired young lieutenant and his driver were brought before me. The lieutenant was the snobbish, arrogant type of Englishman. Very correctly, he gave me his service number only, no other details. I tried to get into conversation with him and told him of my visits to London, of my friends, including a captain in the Grenadier Guards. He gradually thawed and turned out to be the nephew of one of the owners of Players Cigarettes. My officers made a whispered suggestion and I had to laugh. "Lieutenant, what would you say to our swapping you and your driver for cigarettes? We're a bit short at the moment." "Good idea," he said. "How many cigarettes do you think you are worth? What should I suggest to your commander?" His answer came without hesitation. "1 million cigarettes, that's 100,000 packets." My radio officer made contact with the Royal Dragoons, and I passed on our offer. "Please wait, we'll come back to you at once," was the reply. Then, after a few minutes, "Sorry, we're a bit short ourselves, but we could offer 600,000 cigarettes. Come in, please." To my great astonishment, I received a flat refusal from the young lieutenant. "Not one cigarette less than 1,000,000, that's final," was his answer. So the young man had to pay for the high value he set on himself with captivity. A week later, shortly before dark, our doctor disappeared behind a rise for the indispensable spade trip. "Doctor," I called out to him, "don't go too far, it'll soon be dark." He didn't seem to hear me and went on. When he hadn't come back after half an hour, we began to be worried. The doctor was not only very popular. With his tropical experience, he was vital to us. We sent out some men and fired the prearranged light signals. The doctor remained missing. Had he lost his way, or had he been caught by the British? "Yes, we've got your doctor. He ran straight into our patrol on its way back. This time we have a suggestion. The Japanese have cut our communications with the Far East. We can't get quinine anymore and are suffering badly from malaria. Can we exchange your doctor for some of your synthetic atibrin? Come in, please." "Please wait," I replied. A moral issue now presented itself. Which was more important, to weaken the fighting strength of the British through malaria, or to get our doctor back? I quickly made up my mind. "Okay, we'll do business. How many packets do you want for the doctor?" We agreed at once on a quantity that we could spare, and arranged the exchange for the following morning. From either side, a jeep with a white flag drove between the lines for the ceremonial trade. "An expensive spade trip, Doctor. Good to have you back." Rommel, to whom I related this on one of his visits, was understanding. "That's what I thought about the British. I'm glad you can practice this fair play here in the desert. On the coast, it's just a matter of survival." Only once was our agreement unintentionally broken. One evening, a patrol returned to base from its operation with a British supply truck. The leader of the patrol was a young lieutenant who had joined us from Germany only a short time before. "Major," he reported proudly, "the truck is full of corned beef and other tins, beer and cigarettes." "When and where did you capture it?" was my first question. It turned out that he had captured the truck toward 5:30 p.m., hence after the agreed time. "Are you mad? You know the arrangement. This will not be the end of the matter." The lieutenant was astonished. "But these are things that are really useful to us, and which will be denied to the British. War is war." I had an idea of what would happen, and at once sent off a radio message to Rommel. "Have impression that British patrols intend to outflank us in the south. Suggest moving south." Rommel agreed and sent word that another small unit would take over my position the following day. I briefed the leader of the unit on the situation in my area and warned him expressly against British patrols, which would appear suddenly and try to take prisoners among us. In the afternoon I moved south. What I had suspected promptly occurred. In the evening, toward 5:30 p.m., a British detachment raided the unit, captured 2 trucks, and disappeared into the darkness. A gentleman's agreement was, after all, a gentleman's agreement. The end of our agreement came later, somewhere in the depths of the Tunisian desert. For some days we had lost contact with the 2 British battalions. Then an orderly came to my command car one evening. "There's a Bedouin here who wants to talk to you, Major." With a deep bow, the Bedouin came in. "Salam, I have a letter for you. I will wait for an answer." A Bedouin with a letter here deep in the desert, where by rights no one could find us? The Bedouins always seemed to know where we were. I opened the letter. From CO Royal Dragoons. "Dear Major von Luck, we have had other tasks and so were unable to keep in touch with you. The war in Africa has been decided, I'm glad to say, not in your favour. I should like, therefore, to thank you and all your people, in the name of my officers and men, for the fair play with which we have fought against each other on both sides. I and my battalion hope that all of you will come out of the war safe and sound, and that we may find the opportunity to meet again sometime, in more favourable circumstances. With the greatest respect." I sat down at the table and wrote a similar note to the Royal Dragoons. "Give this letter to the man from whom you received the one to me," I told the Bedouin. "Say to him, many thanks, but don't betray where you found us." Heavy downpours of rain set in, which gave us time to consolidate the Mersa El Brega position. The deluges of rain were a hindrance, not only to us, but also to the 2 British battalions. We couldn't use the wadis, which gave us cover, for torrents of water 3 feet deep were carrying all before them. We were now stationed south of Ajdabiya, not far from the border between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. On the 20th of November, I was ordered to go in the Fieseler to Rommel, who for a short time had his HQ near an airfield. Rommel looked exhausted. His uniform was worn and dusty. The hard withdrawal actions, his deep disappointment and his illness, not yet fully cured, had left their mark on him. He greeted me briefly. Instead of giving me fresh orders, for which I had flown to see him, Rommel took my arm. "Come, we'll go for a little walk." General Gauss nodded to me, as if pleased to be able to divert Rommel somewhat. We strolled along the edge of the airfield. "I no longer know how to cope with the supply problem," Rommel began. "A few days ago, an Italian destroyer with 500 tons of fuel turned west and unloaded at Tripoli instead of here in Benghazi. Kesselring has now promised me fuel by airlift. The first 50 Ju-52s are on their way here. In the distance we could hear the drone of engines. Also, however, the rattle of anti-aircraft cannon. Out of the 50 machines, only 5 landed shortly afterward. The rest had been shot down over the sea. How could the British have known about them? We know today that it was Jean Howard and her friends in Bletchley Park at work." Rommel was extremely frustrated and stamped his feet. "Uck, that's the end. We can't even hold Tripolitania, but must fall back on Tunisia. There, in addition, we shall come upon the Americans, and possibly also the French, who are supposed to be marching with a combat group from Chad through the desert on southern Tunisia. What I was afraid of weeks ago will then occur. Our proud Africa army and the new divisions that have landed in northern Tunisia will be lost. First, the loss of Stalingrad, with 200,000 battle-tried men. Now we're losing Africa too, with elite divisions." I was much disturbed. "Field Marshal, we still have a chance. The men are behind you. Their morale is first class. If we can get sufficient supplies, we're bound to pull it off." Rommel smiled. "I know, and I'm proud of the men. But the supplies will not be forthcoming. Hitler's HQ has already written off this theatre of war. All he requires now is that the German soldier stands or dies. What we need is to create a German Dunkirk. That means flying out as many officers, men and specialists as possible to Sicily, while leaving the material behind. We need the men for the decisive struggle in Europe." "How will you ever put that to Hitler?" I asked. "After consulting Kesselring and the Italians, I shall fly to Hitler at Rastenburg and make my opinion clear to him, beyond all doubt. My word still counts for something. I am still respected among the people and by my men. I don't believe anymore that we shall get what we need in further divisions, aircraft and supplies, in order to turn the wheel yet again." His face was lined, his shoulders drooping. He was the picture of dejection. "Luck, the war is lost," he said. I was appalled. Was everything to have been in vain? "We're still deep in Russia," I protested. "Half Europe is occupied by us. Bitter though the loss of North Africa will be, we can carry on the fight in Europe and bring about a change of fortune. Luck, we've got to seek an armistice, precisely because we still have a lot of pawns in hand. If possible, an armistice with the Western Allies. We still have something to offer. This assumes, of course, that Hitler must be forced to abdicate, that we must give up the persecution of the Jews at once and make concessions to the Church. That may sound utopian, but it is the only way of avoiding further bloodshed and still more destruction in our cities." What had brought Rommel to this complete reversal in his attitude to Hitler and the war? Without doubt, his great disappointment at being left on his own, as well as the disregard for his ideas and the importance of this theatre of war. We walked back slowly to his HQ. Once again, Rommel took my arm. "Luck, one day you will think of my words. The threat to Europe and to our civilized world will come from the East. If the peoples of Europe fail to join forces to meet that threat, Western Europe will have lost. At the moment, I see only one warrior prepared to champion a united Europe, Churchill." I was deeply impressed by Rommel's words. As General Gauss told me at the beginning of December, Rommel had a decisive conference with Marshals Kesselring and Cavaliero on the 24th of November. On the 28th of November, he flew to Rastenburg in East Prussia to see Hitler. The crucial meeting had the opposite effect of that for which Rommel had hoped. Hitler regarded Rommel as sick and run down, and his report on the situation as greatly exaggerated. He angrily refused to even consider evacuation of the Africa army. Goering manoeuvred himself into the foreground and promised Hitler that he would give the war in North Africa the decisive turn with his Luftwaffe. Goering had been angry with Rommel ever since the latter had remarked that the Goering divisions and the Waffen-SS were merely Praetorian guards and should be incorporated in the army. Rommel went back to his men, although it was suggested that he should take treatment for his tropical disease. All he brought with him was empty promises of support. On the 13th of November, after all its stores and installations had been destroyed, Tobruk was taken by the British without a struggle. Much blood had been shed there on both sides during the previous 18 months. The retreat through southern Cyrenaica was a masterly achievement by Rommel. Except for a great deal of material, we suffered hardly any losses. The fuel problem had become increasingly critical. Of the 250 tons promised by air transport, only 60 had arrived. With that, we could cover just 150 kilometers and had to avoid getting into any battles. Thankfully, the heavy rain that had set in also prevented the British from pursuing us. Italian destroyers with fuel on board turned west. The Africa Corps was again left standing without fuel. With the last reserves, we managed to bring the motorized panzer units behind the Mersa-El Brega line. Rommel was reckoning on a strong flanking attack around the Salt Lake south of Mersa-El Brega. I had to reconnoiter with greater intensity in this area. At the same time, my reconnaissance group was broken up. The 2 Voss and Linau battalions were sent north. Only the Nisa battalion remained with us. Gauss called us again. Through lack of fuel, we cannot engage in a battle with the British at or south of Mersa-El Brega. Everything points to a strong British attack. From the 6th of December, the non-motorized German and Italian elements were moved to Tunisia, which was not easy, owing to shortage of petrol. The supply problem became ever more critical. Time and again, whole divisions or sections were left immobile. It was only thanks to great combat experience and outstanding morale that it was somehow contrived again and again to release them from encirclement as soon as some fuel could be organized. I had to give up the Fiesler stalk again. It was needed at HQ. I had to draw the net of patrols much tighter. Thank goodness our air reconnaissance to the south was intensified. In the course of it, we came to be attacked by our own fighters, who didn't expect to find us so far south. During air attacks, everyone had to leave his vehicle and lie flat on the sand 20 to 30 yards away. The radio operator often stayed voluntarily at his post to send off our reports. Our aerial reconnaissance reported that, to the south, a strong column, probably a complete British tank division, was preparing to outflank the Nephilia position. On the 17th of December, I moved my battalion north, where, with other elements of the Africa Corps, we launched an attack in the flank of this division. Together, we were able to knock out 20 British tanks with our 88mm guns, and for the time being, avert the danger, while the remains of the Africa Army were fighting for their lives on the coast and suffering constantly from shortage of fuel. We went back into the desert. The danger of a fresh attempt to outflank us remained too great. South of the Buerat line, we came across our British friends again, and the old ceremonial of the 5 o'clock agreement was resumed. But we also stumbled on the tracks of the long-range desert group, tracks that led to the west. General Gauss sent word that the British had apparently been forced to make a pause, since they had to reorganize their supply routes. But another outflanking attack was expected from the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Sterling. Our task, to reconnoiter more intensively as far as south of Homs Tripoli, with particular attention to an almost insurmountable north-south mountain range between Homs and Tripoli,